Hi, I am Aurel Enriquez, and this presentation contains our discussion on the nervous system. This slide shows us the two divisions of the nervous system, CNS or the central nervous system, and PNS or the peripheral nervous system. Central consists of the brain and spinal cord. Peripheral consists of all the nerves that extend outwards or distal to the spinal cord. Listed here are the functions of the nervous system. First up is sensory input, whether this would be physical input such as the cold or the heat or being punched in the face. Pwede rin naman pong non-physical input such as hearing sounds or being presented with new information. So yun po yung next, di ba? Integrating or processing that information. The brain would now decide what to do with that information. Next is controlling the muscles and glands. So this is applicable both for voluntary and involuntary muscles. Yung brain pa rin po yung responsible sa pagpapakilos sa kanila. Ang pinagkaiba lang po is that voluntary muscles, sinasadya natin or tayo yung nagdedesisyon para kumilos sila. But for involuntary muscles, kahit hindi natin to sadyang isipin, yung brain na yung bahala na magpakilos sa kanila as necessary or as needed. Next is maintaining homeostasis or balance. So kahit anong klaseng imbalance pa yan. Hormonal imbalance, the brain would communicate with the endocrine system. Imbalance with body temperature, the brain would communicate with the integumentary, muscular, and cardiovascular system. Electrolyte imbalance, the brain will communicate with the kidneys. So those are just a few examples of how the C and S would maintain homeostasis. Last one is establishing and maintaining mental activity. So ito na po yung part where our nervous system makes us nervous. All right, so feeling different emotions is a product of mental activity. So contrary to the popular saying that emotions come from the heart, no, not really. To simplify, emotions are our response to some stimuli that has been presented to us, and that response is because a mental activity or processing of information happened in our brain. Nabanggit ko na po kanina ito, the central nervous system is comprised of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system includes all other nerve tissues extending out of the CNS. Now, what is the sensory division? This conducts action potentials from sensory receptors in the CNS. Basically, ito po yung division ng nervous system natin na nagtatrabaho para magawa niya yung number one dun sa listahan ng functions niya kanina, which is to receive sensory input. Next, we have the motor division. So this conducts action potentials to organs like muscles and glands. Basically, ito po yung nagpapakilos sa mga organs natin if needed. So as the name implies, no, motor, this is responsible for movement. But wait, there's more. Next is the somatic nervous system. This transmits action potentials from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles. So ito naman po, mas specific, no? So mas specific. Ang inuutusan daw po nito specifically ng somatic nervous system natin ay yung mga skeletal muscles. So hindi damay sa somatic division yung cardiac and smooth muscles. So sino pong bahala? Who's the boss of the smooth and cardiac muscles? It's the autonomic nervous system. Next is the enteric nervous system. When we say enteric, this is anything that has something to do with only the digestive tract. This slide shows us kind of like an organizational chart for our nervous system, showing the different divisions that we just talked about. Let's now talk about the cells of our nervous system. Neurons receive stimuli, conduct action potentials, and send signals to the other neurons or the effector organs. Kumbaga siya yung leader Right? So siya yung tagabuhat sa group work, no? Siya yung gumagawa ng halos lahat. Next are glial cells. So glial cells, these are the supportive cells present at both the central and peripheral nervous system. They don't conduct action potentials. They can't do the things that neurons would do, but being the supportive friend that they are, they can enhance, they can enhance neuron function. And ayun po, so glial cells are kind of like your supportive bestie that encourages you to do things. Let's now further discuss neurons, specifically its parts. So the cell body is kind of like the main component of neurons because this is where we would find the nucleus. The dendrite is where the cytoplasm is. And kakaiba po kasi yung shape ng mga dendrites. So they're not exactly round like the cytoplasm of most cells that we've talked about in the past. So meron siyang cytoplasmic extensions that are capable of receiving and transmitting chemical signals and other information. So yung mga dendrites po, kaya nilang makipag-communicate. Alright, so dendrites can receive info from other neurons and transmit that information to the cell body para ma-process ito ng neuron. Third component is the axon. Okay, so the axon is a long tail-like structure extending away from the cell body. So yung mga axons po, trabaho nilang mag-send ng sensory signals papunta sa central nervous system. And also, to send motor signals paalis ng CNS at papunta sa effector organs or yung organs na dapat mag-react in this situation. This illustration shows us the basic structure of a typical neuron. So here's the cell body, and then these short branch-like cytoplasmic extensions are the dendrites, and then this long segment right here is the axon. Neurons also have different structural types. Multipolar neurons have many dendrites but just one axon. So yung photo na nakita po natin kanina on the previous slide, that's an example of a multipolar neuron. So karamihan po or majority ng neurons natin ay multipolar. Next, bipolar neurons, as the name implies, only have two processes or two extensions, one dendrite and one axon. So bipolar neurons can be found in some sensory organs like the eyes and nasal cavity. There's also what are called pseudo-unipolar neurons. So they only have one structure extending away from the cell body. So mukhang isa lang yung process niya or extension niya. But this one extension actually branches, no? It actually branches into two. So magkaiba rin daw po yung direction ng branches nito. One extends to the central nervous system while the other extends to the peripheral. This slide shows us illustrations on the three types of neurons. So multipolar neurons are the most common, maraming dendrite extensions at may isang axon lang. Bipolar neurons have only one dendrite and one axon, and then the pseudopolar or pseudo-unipolar neurons look like they only have one axon, but actually this branches into two. Let's now talk about glial cells. Again, they're the supporting cells of the central and peripheral nervous system. There are actually many different types of this. First up are astrocytes. And for the most part, ang mga astrocytes po ay para sa CNS. Alright, so they can either stimulate or inhibit. So either ine-encourage daw nila or pinipigilan nila the signaling activity of nearby neurons from the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is a highly selective, semi-permeable border of endothelial tissues that control substances that could pass through or from the blood circulation papunta sa nervous system. So, bali yung mga astrocytes daw po, tutulong sila na either mag-stimulate or mag-inhibit ng mga signals na manggagaling sa blood-brain barrier. The next supportive cells are ependymal cells. So they line the cavities or the hollow spaces of the brain that contains cerebrospinal fluid. So sila rin, yung mga ependymal cells din po, sila rin yung nagpo-produce ng cerebrospinal fluid. Next are microglial cells. So microglial cells work as if they're part of the immune system. Microglial cells could get rid of bacteria and cell debris in case may mga na-damage na cells sa central nervous system. Next are oligodendrocytes. So they provide myelin to the axons of neurons in the CNS. Myelin is made up of proteins and fatty substances that forms a sheath or covering around the axons. Next are Schwann cells. Schwann cells also provide myelin, but these ones sa peripheral nervous system po sila nagwo-work. So again, in comparison to oligodendrocytes, no, they also provide myelin. Pero ang oligodendrocytes nasa CNS, ang Schwann cells ay nasa PNS. So same function, different location. This slide shows us an illustration on what those cells we just talked about would probably look like. Let's now talk about the myelin sheath. These are structures that wrap around the axons of neurons. If a neuron has an axon wrapped in myelin sheath, tatawagin po natin ito myelinated. This implies the existence of neurons that are not myelinated. Okay? Hindi daw po lahat ng neurons ay merong myelinated na axon. In the central nervous system, yung mga oligodendrocytes po yung nagsiserve to form myelin sheaths. But at the peripheral nervous system, it's the Schwann cells that work to create the myelin sheath. There may be spaces or gaps in the myelin sheath, and these are called the nodes of Ranvier. So ions can diffuse in and out of the neurons through these nodes of Ranvier. Aside from just being a physical insulation or covering, trabaho din daw po ng mga myelin sheath is to increase the speed and efficiency of action potentials passing through axons. Now, what happens if yung mga neurons na supposedly myelinated ay nagkaroon ng problems? There's a disease of the myelin sheath that is known as multiple sclerosis, and this leads to the loss of muscle function. Kasi po, diba? The movement of muscles are also controlled by the action potentials being generated by neurons. So, kung may problema dun sa structure ng neurons, magkakaproblema din po yung capability nila to control the function of muscles. Let's now talk about neurons that are naturally unmyelinated. Mga neurons na normal lang sa kanila na wala po silang myelin sheath. These could usually be found in indentations of oligodendrocytes kung nasa CNS or Schwann cells kung nasa PNS po yung neuron na ino-observe natin. We'll better understand this if we take a look at the illustration on the next slide. Here's a side-by-side illustration of a myelinated axon in comparison to unmyelinated axons. Notice that if an axon is myelinated, mag-isa niya lang, and is very well wrapped up in that myelin sheath. In comparison to unmyelinated axons, there are multiples of them embedded in just one Schwann cell, and they're not even fully covered, as you can see in the exposed areas right here. So those are the differences between a myelinated axon compared to an unmyelinated axon. Now, the color of the nervous tissue depends on the amount of myelinated neurons in that specific area. Gray matter is composed of neurons where there's little amounts of melanin. White matter is composed of bundles of axons with myelin sheaths. So ulitin po natin, gray matter, less myelin. White matter, more myelin. Let's now talk about how nerve cells communicate. Here we use the term excitable. Nerve cells that are previously resting have the capability to respond or react to stimuli. So these reactions or changes becomes a way for nerve cells to communicate with one another. For humans, this is comparable to body language. So if a person moves closer to you when you're talking, it means that they're comfortable or they're paying attention to you. If a person slaps you in the face because of what you said, it probably means that they're mad at you. So parang ganun daw po yung mga nerve cells. Their responses or changes because of a stimuli is how they communicate with other cells. Now, how fast are action potentials conducted from one cell to another? As it says here, there is a great variation based on the diameter of the axon fibers. So for those of you who already forgot their geometry, ito po yung ibig sabihin ng diameter. It's the length of a line through the center that touches 2 points on the edge of the circle, as you can see right here in this pop-up illustration. So to simplify, yung bilis daw po ng pag-transmit ng action potentials ay nakadepende sa lapad ng axon. Medium-sized axons conduct action potentials much slower, no? 15 meters per second lang daw po. Larger axons have a higher conduction velocity or mas mabilis daw po silang mag-send ng signals at 120 meters per second. So ulitin po natin, no? Medium diameter axons, slower. Large diameter axons, faster. Let's now talk about synapses or neuronal synapses. These are spaces where an axon of a neuron would interact with another neuron. So yung dulo daw po ng axon would be called the pre-synaptic terminal, habang yung membrane naman daw po nung katabi niyang neuron kung saan siya makikipag-communicate, that would be called the post-synaptic terminal. Next term that we need to know are neurotransmitters. So any chemical being released by one neuron through its axon at the presynaptic terminal na mapupunta doon sa postsynaptic terminal ng katabi niyang neuron is known as a neurotransmitter. Again, isimplify po natin yung explanation na yun. Neurotransmitters are chemicals released by neurons that could send signals to other neurons. On this slide, focus lang po tayo dun sa mahalaga, and that's acetylcholine and norepinephrine. The most well-known examples of neurotransmitters are acetylcholine and norepinephrine. On this slide, na-mention din po ang acetylcholinesterase. It has the capability to break down acetylcholine. So yun lang muna po yung kailangan nating tandaan from this slide. Again, acetylcholinesterase has the capability of destroying the structure of acetylcholine or breaking down acetylcholine. This slide shows us an illustration on where pre- and post-synaptic terminals are located and kung saan po nanggagaling and pumupunta yung mga neurotransmitters. This slide talks about neuronal pathways, also known as converging. This is basically how neurons are arranged. Kung nasaan yung postsynaptic terminals, ilang neurons yung nasa presynaptic terminal, and other stuff like that. A converging pathway is when two or more neurons serve as a presynaptic terminal and send signals to the same neuron having only one postsynaptic terminal. Kapag sinabi naman pong diverging pathway, kabaliktaran ng converging, only one neuron makes a presynaptic terminal, but it's sending a signal to multiple neurons with multiple postsynaptic terminals. This slide illustrates to us a converging versus a diverging pathway. Sa converging daw po, dalawa yung nagsisend, pero isa lang yung nagre-receive. Pero kapag sinabi pong diverging, isa lang yung nagsisend, pero multiple neurons ang nakaka-receive. So the diverging pathway is kind of like me in our group chat. Di ba po? So, isa ko lang na nagsasend ng information, pero marami kayo na nakaka-receive ng information or yung announcements, di ba po? So that's an example, or that's a metaphor for the diverging pathway. This ends part 1 of our discussion on the nervous system. In this recording, itutuloy ko na po yung discussion to part 2 para isang file na lang po yung ida-download nyo. This presentation contains part 2 of our discussion on the nervous system. In part 1, we focus mainly on neurons, their structure or their microscopic anatomy, and how they communicate with one another. Here in part 2, we'll look into the gross anatomy of the CNS and PNS, including their parts and their functions. Just a recap, the nervous system is divided into the central and peripheral nervous system. The central is physically composed of the brain and spinal cord, while the peripheral is composed of all the other nerves extending to the outside of the brain and spinal cord. On this slide, let's look at the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. Simula po sa foramen magnum hanggang sa second lumbar vertebra, yun daw po yung kahabaan ng spinal cord. So this is protected by the vertebral column, which is a component of the skeletal system. Yung capability po natin to move our torso is thanks to the nerves on our spine. Now, any damage to the spinal cord could lead to paralysis. Depende kung saang segment po ng spinal cord yung injured. Doon din po magsisimula yung affected areas of paralysis. If, for example, a person damages or obtains damage from their L1, then all the other areas below that, yun po yung mapaparalyze. Alright? So, hindi na makakalakad yung pasyente. If the damage occurs at a much higher location, let's imagine at the third vertebral or third cervical vertebra, or nandito, no? Then simula doon, pababa, mapaparalyze po, no, yung buong area na yon. They wouldn't be able to move their shoulders, their arms, lower torso, up to their legs. Now, why is that? Bakit po pababa yung mga areas na nagiging affected? Because the brain is located superior to all these places. So if you cut off the connection to the brain, then mawawala rin po yung capability ng brain to send action potentials or control the motor division of all these muscles below. We've already talked about this in part 1. There is what is known as the gray matter and white matter. The gray matter doesn't have a lot of myelin, and as we can see right here, the gray matter is located in the middle of the spinal cord in a butterfly shape or letter H shape arrangement. Tapos yung white matter naman po, it contains a lot of myelin, and this is seen on the outer areas of the spinal cord. Based po sa letter H na shape ng gray matter, different areas also houses neurons that serve different functions in the nervous system. The posterior horns contains axons that communicate with interneurons. Anterior horns have somatic neurons, lateral horns have autonomic neurons, and in the middle is a central canal filled with fluid. So mamaya po, we'll further discuss what we mean by somatic, autonomic, as well as the purpose of the fluid in the middle. This slide shows us where each of the horns are located and what types of neurons can be found in each horn. Let's now talk about reflexes. Reflex is an involuntary action. All right, so reflexes, this is something na hindi natin sinasadya, no? But this is a response to a stimulus that has been applied to the periphery and transmitted to the CNS. So basically, may stimulus daw po tayong na-receive, and this was sent to the central nervous system. Reflexes allow a person to react to stimuli more quickly than is possible if conscious thought is involved. So, mas mabilis daw po yung reaction time if yung reflexes natin yung involved, instead of us still having to go through the act of making a conscious decision kung mag-react ba tayo to something. Alright, so for reflexes, no, we could kind of say that this is something that involuntarily happens. Or yun nga po, as mentioned in the first bullet, this is an involuntary reaction. We don't have to think about this. It just happens as a response to stimuli. A reflex arc is the neuronal pathway by which a reflex would occur and has 5 basic components. So let's take a look at those 5 steps on how a reflex arc would happen. Here are the 5 easy steps on how stimuli is processed to produce a reaction. Char, infomercial yun. Um, but yeah, that's how it is. We call it the reflex arc, and it's basically the steps on how stimuli is received and processed to make a reaction. So number 1, a receptor would, or sensory receptor would receive the stimuli. Number 2, a sensory neuron would process that information and then pass it on to interneurons in the form of chemical signals or action potentials. Number 3, interneurons would receive that information. Number 4, it is then sent to motor neurons, which are mainly responsible for communicating with muscles, until finally, number 5, it would reach the effector organs, or the organ that needs to react to the stimulus. Okay, so kung hindi daw po kasama sa steps yung mga interneurons, then we would refer to that as the simplest reflex arcs. Here's an illustration on how reflex arcs would happen. A sensory receptor would receive the stimuli, a sensory neuron would process and send that to the interneuron. The interneuron would then send it to a motor neuron. Then this motor neuron would send that processed information to the effector organ, and then the effector organ would react accordingly. Okay, so it's interesting to note that ilang minuto natin tong inaral, di ba? But for the nervous system, all of these processes would happen in less than a second. The stretch reflex is when the muscles contract in response to a stretching force. So may nag-stretch daw po dun sa muscle, that's why it's reacting. That's the stretch reflex. The knee-jerk reflex is an example of a stretch reflex. So basically, a medical professional would lightly hit a person's patella or knee bone with a reflex hammer, which looks like this, no? And then they would observe how the person would react. Next is the withdrawal reflex, also called the flexor reflex. It's to quickly remove a limb away from a painful or shocking stimulus. So, may nahawakan kang basa sa table mo, you'll move your hand away. Napasok ka habang nagluluto, you'll move your hand away even quicker. Alright, so these are examples of withdrawal reflex. You literally withdraw a body part away from the source of stimulus. This illustration shows us how a withdrawal reflex would work in relation to the reflex arc that we just talked about earlier. Let's now talk about the brain. The brain is the most important organ in our body. And that's according to the brain itself. Yung brain po mismo, no? Ang nagdesisyon na siya yung pinakamahalaga. But we'll get to that later. Now we'll understand why and how did the brain become so important. The brain has 4 major regions: the brainstem, cerebellum, diencephalon, and cerebrum. Let's first look into the brainstem. It is divided into 3 components: the medulla oblongata, pons, and midbrain. The medulla oblongata is continuous with the spinal cord. Again, the specific segment that connects the brain with the spinal cord is the medulla oblongata. So listed here are its functions. This part of our brain controls our heart rate. It could contract or dilate blood vessels. It controls our breathing, so we don't have to consciously think about it. The medulla oblongata mostly controls things that should happen involuntarily, like coughing, sneezing, keeping our balance. The pons is located above the medulla, and it is the bridge or connection between the cerebrum and cerebellum. So the pons also helps to control breathing. It also helps us with things that we need to be able to do when we eat, like chewing, salivation, and swallowing. And since yung question na po ay nasa gitna ng cerebrum and cerebellum, nagiging relay station or parang communication center na rin po siya for the cerebrum and cerebellum. The midbrain is right above the pons, and it works to coordinate our eye movement. It also helps with adjusting our pupil diameter. So for example, kung masyadong maliwanag, the iris of the pupils will close or become narrow so that less light would come in. Kung madilim naman po, the iris of the pupils will open wider in an attempt to let more light in. Certain emotions could also influence the movement of our iris and pupils, so the midbrain also has something to do with that. As we can see right here, turning the head towards a noise is also the work of our midbrain. So, kapag narinig nyo nag-aaway yung kapitbahay nyo and you direct your attention to that, no, that's a combination of your midbrain doing its job and also yung pagiging marites mo. This slide talks about the other components of the brain stem, such as reticular formation. So this one does not have a specific location, rather it is scattered across the brain stem, and listed here are its functions. Let's now look into the cerebellum. The cerebellum is attached to the brain stem, and the attaching structures are called cerebellar peduncles. The term cerebellum actually means little brain with how the cerebellum is shaped. It has a cortex composed of gyri, sulci, and gray matter. The cerebellum also works to control balance. So ano po, yung isa pang part ng brain na na-discuss na natin kanina, which also helps with balance? The medulla oblongata. All right, so listed here are the other functions of the cerebellum. Let's now move over to the diencephalon. So the diencephalon has three components: the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. The thalamus is the largest part of the diencephalon. The thalamus works to regulate or control the sensory input na manggagaling sa spinal cord and brainstem papunta sa cerebral cortex. This is also the part of our brain responsible for moods. So kung moody kang tao, mabilis magbago-bago yung mood mo, well, baka very active ang iyong thalamus. The epithalamus is just right above the thalamus. The epithalamus is what's responsible for our reaction to smell. As it says right here, it's for the emotional and visceral response to odors. So kapag may naamoy kang scent and it reminds you of a place or a person or food or your childhood, then that's your epithalamus working. Another example is kapag may naamoy kang something, tapos bigla kang nasusuka, that's a reaction that was also brought about by your epithalamus. The epithalamus also houses what is known as the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a part of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus is located below the thalamus. So, i-recap po natin yung arrangement nila. We have the thalamus, the largest part of the diencephalon. Sa itaas ng thalamus is the epithalamus. Tapos sa ilalim naman ay yung hypothalamus. So, the hypothalamus mainly controls the pituitary gland na pag-uusapan din po natin further when we get into the endocrine system. The structure that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland is known as the infundibulum. And listed here are its functions. This slide shows us an illustration of all the structures that make up the diencephalon. Let's now talk about the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest major segment of the brain, and it is divided into the left and right hemisphere. The space in between them is called the longitudinal fissure. So this photo right here shows us the different lobes. The cerebral cortex is at the surface of the cerebrum, which is composed of gray matter. Again, what is gray matter? These are nervous tissue that has very little amounts of myelin. This is the part of a brain that is responsible for thinking, and communicating. So, if may mga kakilala kayong hindi nag-iisip o kaya naman ay napakahirap kausapin, baka may problem po sa cerebral cortex niya. The cerebrum is also the part of our brain that helps us remember, understand, and make voluntary movements. I think for me personally, very active po yung cerebral cortex ko dahil overthinker ako at masyado akong understanding. Let us look at the structures na makikita natin sa cerebrum. The longitudinal fissure divides it into the left and right hemispheres. The gyri are folded areas or yung mga parts na naka-curve paangat. The sulci are the shallow indentations or yung mga mabababaw lang daw po na curves that go inward. Pero kapag yung curves na paloob ay mas malalim, we would now call those fissures. So according to a publication from the ResearchGate, the number of sulcal pits in the left posterior inferior frontal sulcus and the right posterior inferior temporal sulcus was positively related to average IQ. According to the psychologist Sir Rex Young from the University of New Mexico, all of the wrinkles and convolutions on our brain allow more of that computational capacity to fit in. So in other words, mas madami daw pong gyri and sulci ang brain ng isang person, the more wrinkles that they have in their brain, no, the more intelligent a person is. So, with that information, kung halimbawa ay galit po kayo sa isang tao, no, imbis na sabihin, ang bobo mo, you could just say, wow, napaka-smooth ng utak mo. The left hemisphere of the brain controls the right side of the body. The left side of our brain has also been known to be the more analytical side, capable of understanding and solving mathematical equations or making sensible speech or learning a new language. The right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, and this side helps us more on the things that require creativity, like making music, creating any art form, or formulating abstract ideas. But we gotta understand though, na hindi po ibig sabihin nito ay sobrang magkahiwalay yung functions ng left and right hemisphere. They would always be working together. If, for example, you're making music where your left brain, or your right brain would typically lead the way, of course, you still have to analyze, diba? Which beat would be better to set the vibe of the song. You'll have to analyze the instrumental arrangement and other technical stuff like that. Same with the left brain, all right? So for example, I am trying to learn a new language. A little bit of creativity might go into the process of how I would remember new words. Okay, so yun po. The left and right hemisphere, for the most part, usually always works together. The structure that connects the left and right hemisphere is called the corpus callosum. The frontal lobe of the brain controls voluntary motor functions or yung movement ng muscles natin that we have to consciously think about for them to happen. All right, so the frontal lobe also influences our mood, and this is the site of aggression. So kung may kakilala po kayong laging galit or napakabilis magalit, baka po may something wrong sa frontal cortex nila. The parietal lobe is located at the top, and it mainly works to process sensory input, such as those that are listed right here. The occipital lobe is located posteriorly or at the back of the brain and controls our vision or our eyes. The temporal lobes are at the sides, and their function involves hearing, smelling, and memory. This photo shows us a superior or top view of where each hemispheres and lobes are located. Let's talk about speech. First is sensory speech, which is processed by the Wernicke's area. This is located at the parietal lobe. So Wernicke's area, this is where comprehension of the words we hear would happen. So Kapag may kakilala kayo na hirap umintindi na masasabi nyo, baka may problem sa vernix area nila. Next is motor speech, which is processed by the Broca's area. So that's located at the frontal lobe. This is where words are formulated. So yung mga sinasabi po natin, before we actually say them, they were first pieced together at the Broca's area. Now, how are disorders of the brain diagnosed? With the help of the electroencephalogram, or EEG, doctors will be able to monitor the electrical activities of the brain. Listed here are the different brain waves na now-observed din po ng mga scientists using the electroencephalogram. So alpha waves are produced by people when they are awake but also quiet. Beta waves are seen during intense mental activities. Delta waves are observed during deep sleep, and theta waves are typically observed among the brains of children. This slide shows a person having an EEG test. Let's now talk about memory. The term working memory is when the brain stores information only for a very short period of time dahil lang kailangan ito ng person for the current task that they're doing. So, an activity is involved, kaya lang po tinatandaan muna ng brain ang isang bagay. Magkaiba po ito sa short-term memory. Short-term memory lasts a bit longer in comparison to working memory. So, an information is stored in the brain for a few days at maximum. There are short-term memories that are eventually converted or that eventually become long-term memories. So, nagiging permanente na po sa brain yung information. This happens by consolidation. So, when we say consolidation, this is a gradual process where new connections and stronger synaptic connections are created, or they're being formed in between neurons. So, nakaka-apekto din daw po sa long-term memory kung gaano natin kadalas ginagamit yung mga information na to. Declarative memory, also known as explicit memory, keeps information like names, dates, places, and even emotional cues. So generally, declarative memory handles facts and feelings. Procedural memory, also called reflexive memory, involves motor skills like driving, doing sports, playing instruments. So in other words, muscle memory. On this slide, ang pinakailangan lang po natin tandaan is what the limbic system does. So the limbic system influences long-term declarative memory and also emotions and visceral responses to emotions, plus motivation and mood. So mostly the intangible things, or yun nga po, nakapokus ang limbic system sa emotions. So kung may kakilala po kayo na masyadong emotional, no, baka po nagtatrabaho lang ng mabuti yung limbic system niya. This illustration shows us the physical or structural components of the limbic system. Let's now talk about the coverings of the brain and spinal cord, called the meninges. The outermost is the dura mater, and since siya rin po yung nasa pinakalabas, no, siya yung first physical line of defense of the brain and spinal cord, this would also be the toughest layer. The second layer is the arachnoid matter. The space between the dura and arachnoid is called the subdural space. So literally, this is a space under the dura mater. The third layer in the meninges is the pia mater, which is directly attached or tightly bound on the surface of the brain and spinal cord. So ang pia mater po, nakadikit daw po siya ng mabuti dun sa brain and spinal cord. Take note though na may space din po bago mag-pia mater sa ilalim ng arachnoid. So this is called the subarachnoid space. Dito po located yung mga blood vessels that would supply the needs of the brain and spinal cord. These illustrations show us the location of all those meninges and spaces. The cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, is a fluid that is produced by ependymal cells, and this serves to provide a fluid cushion to the central nervous system para po hindi directly na um, nagtatouch or nag-rub against the vertebral column and the skull yung components ng CNS, so the brain and the spinal cord. So maliban sa meninges, no, meron ding fluid that surrounds the brain and spinal cord so that they have something to float on para ayun nga po, hindi sila directly gumagasgas dun sa skeletal system natin that is surrounding them. Let's now talk about the autonomic nervous system. It controls the involuntary squad, or yung mga smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. So as it says here, they are controlled unconsciously. So hindi na kailangang isipin or sadyain pa. They will just move as necessary, thanks to our autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is divided into two, the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. Ang kailangan lang po nating tandaan, sympathetic division helps us with physical activities. So kung halimbawa, a person decides to go running, running naturally requires the cardiac muscles to work twice as hard, di ba po? So the sympathetic autonomic division would handle that. Parasympathetic activates totally involuntary functions like digestion or things that should happen even without the stimuli of physical activity. The enteric nervous system is composed of neurons located at the wall of the digestive tract. So isa-isa hindi naman po natin yung components ng digestive tract when we start discussing the digestive system. Now, for the part of the enteric nervous system, it has different types of neurons. The sensory neurons connect the digestive tract to the CNS. The sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons would connect the CNS to the digestive tract. So, pabaliktad po yung direction ng sensory neurons. And then, of course, the enteric neurons are located everywhere else on the enteric plexuses or the enteric area. This ends our discussion on both part 1 and part 2 of the nervous system. For upcoming quizzes, please see the recently posted schedule on our Teams chat. And for any questions related to this recorded discussion, comment below. Char, YouTube yan. Again, for questions related to this recorded discussion, you may send me a direct message on the Microsoft Teams chat. All right, so this has been Professor Aurel Enriquez. Thank you so much for listening.